توجه. اوكي.
أصحاب المعالي والسعادة، السيدات والسادة، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. يسرني في البداية أن أرحب بكم جميعاً في دولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة وعاصمتها أبو ظبي، حيث الحيوية الدائمة والحرص على التجدد والتطور والانشغال بالمستقبل. وأعبر لكم عن عظيم الشكر لحضوركم، كما أود أن أعبر عن خالص الامتنان للضيوف القادمين من خارج الدولة، وبخاصة أولئك الذين يشاركون في الملتقى لأول مرة، متمنية أن تحظوا جميعاً بتجربة ثرية ومتميزة معرفياً وعلمياً وإنسانياً. الحضور الكريم، منذ انتهاء الحرب الباردة يعاني هيكل العلاقات الدولية من الاضطراب وعدم الثبات، فبعد عقود طويلة من استقرار الثنائية القطبية انتقل النظام الدولي إلى الإحادية القطبية. ولكن مع انحسار الدور الأمريكي العالمي المشهود في السنوات الأخيرة وصعود قوى كبرى مثل الصين وروسيا، يشير كثير من التحليلات الاستراتيجية إلى أن العالم يشهد مخاضاً لهيكل دولي قائم على التعددية القطبية، في ظل استمرار الولايات المتحدة كأكبر قوة اقتصادياً وعسكرياً وعلمياً. وأنتج هذا المخاض عصراً جديداً من التنافس بين القوى الكبرى، لكنه تنافس يحدث في بيئة دولية أكثر تعقيداً وأقل يقيناً، كما أنه تنافس لا يصل إلى عتبة اندلاع حرب كبرى، بل ينحصر ضمن ما يوصف بالمنطقة الرمادية التي تقع بين السلم والحرب، والتي يتم فيها توظيف القدرات العسكرية إضافة إلى القدرات الدبلوماسية والاقتصادية والتكنولوجية والسبرانية. وإن ما نشهده مؤخراً من عودة سباق التسلح وتنامي استخدام العقوبات الاقتصادية دولياً وعودة التدابير الحمائية وتقييد نقل التكنولوجيا المتقدمة أو معاقبة شركات تكنولوجية معينة واستخدام التقنيات السبرانية في التأثير في اتجاهات المجتمعات الأخرى أو حتى في مهاجمة أصول دول أخرى، والتسابق في مجال الذكاء الاصطناعي، كلها مؤشرات على التنافس الدولي الجديد. والواقع أن عودة التنافس بين القوى الكبرى على الصعيد الدولي يترافق مع تحولات على الصعد المحلي، وهي التحولات المتمثلة بصعود سياسات الهوية ضمن تعبيراتها الشعبوية العنصرية المغلقة، التي لا تمثل رفضاً للنخب الحاكمة المحلية وسياساتها الاقتصادية فحسب، بل تمثل أيضاً رفضاً للعولمة التي سادت في نظام ما بعد الحرب الباردة، ما يعني أن مبدأ الترابط المتبادل سيواجه تحدياً كبيراً أيضاً في ظل عصر التنافس بين القوى الكبرى. وفي ضوء ذلك فإن رسم خريطة التوزع العالمي للقدرات العسكرية والمالية والاقتصادية وقدرات الذكاء الاصطناعي والفضاء السبراني التي يتم توظيفها ضمن تنافس القوى الجديد لهو أمر مهم لفهم التحولات والاتجاهات الاستراتيجية المستقبلية للنظام الدولي وهيكل العلاقات الدولية. الجمع الموقر. إن إعادة التقييم الاستراتيجي لمنطقة الشرق الأوسط الذي قامت به الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية في مطلع الألفية الثالثة أدى إلى حدوث فراغ وغياب توازن القوى في المنطقة، وبرزت 3 ديناميات لملء هذا الفراغ الناتج عن الانكفاء الأمريكي. الدينامية الأولى هي محاولة القوى المنافسة للولايات المتحدة التقدم في المنطقة مثل روسيا والصين. والدينامية الثانية هي محاولة القوى الإقليمية غير العربية توسيع نفوذها لتحقيق طموحاتها بالهيمنة على الإقليم، وأقصد هنا إيران وتركيا وإسرائيل. أما الدينامية الثالثة فهي تصدر قوى خليجية لتعويض تراجع الدور الأمريكي ومحاولة أخذ زمام المبادرة الإقليمية، وهي هنا تحديداً المملكة العربية السعودية ودولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة. لكن ذلك لم ينتج عن تلك الديناميات قيام حالة من الاستقرار والتوازن في منطقة الشرق الأوسط. والواقع أن التحالف السعودي الإماراتي يحاول إعادة ترميم النظام الإقليمي العربي في مواجهة التحديات الجيوسياسية النابعة من القوى الإقليمية غير العربية وبالذات تركيا وإيران، وكذلك التحديات الداخلية المتمثلة بالإرهاب والفواعل ما دون الدولة والفقر والبطالة، فضلاً عن محاولة تبني نموذج جديد لبناء القوة. وعلى فإن من المهم فهم هيكل النظام الإقليمي الحالي في الشرق الأوسط، وطبيعة العلاقات والتنافس فيما بين قواه وفيما بين القوى الخارجية، وماهية أدوار الأطراف الفاعلة فيه. السيدات والسادة، يهدف ملتقى أبو ظبي الاستراتيجي في نسخته السادسة إلى تقديم توصيف دقيق للنظام الدولي من حيث توزيع القوة واتجاهات القوة المختلفة وطبيعة العلاقات بين الدول الكبرى المتنافسة في اكتساب مزيد من القوة بمنظورات مختلفة أحيانا، وتوفير تحليل علمي لآليات عمل النظام الدولي وتفسير الكيفية التي يمارس بها التأثير في اللاعبين وتحديد مواقعهم وأدوارهم في هذا النظام، والتنبؤ بتحولات النظام الدولي وسلوك اللاعبين فيه ونتاجات اللعبتين الدولية والإقليمية. كما يهدف الملتقى أيضاً إلى تقديم بدائل وخيارات عملية لصانع القرار للتكيف مع هذه التغيرات بما يسهم في تحقيق الأمن والسلم في الإقليم والعالم. ولتحقيق ذلك سيحاول الملتقى بمشاركتكم وإسهاماتكم الإجابة على الأسئلة التالية: كيف تتوزع القوة العسكرية على مستوى العالم؟ وما دور التكنولوجيا في بناء وتوزع القوة العسكرية عالميا؟ ما القوى الدولية التي تجمع بين مقدرات الجيو استراتيجية والمالية؟ وما تأثير الشركات العملاقة في رسم خريطة العالم الجيومالية؟ كيف يؤثر الذكاء الاصطناعي والقدرات السبرانية في تشكيل مستقبل تنافس القوة العالمي؟ كيف يعمل التنافس على موارد الطاقة والثروة التي تولدها على تشكيل العلاقات السياسية والهياكل الاقتصادية فيما بين الدول؟ ما الخريطة الإقليمية التي يمكن رسمها للشرق الأوسط؟ وما احتمالات الأمن والاستقرار والرخاء في منطقة الخليج في ظل عدم التوازن القائم بين دول المنطقة وفي ظل اختلاف منظوراتها للأمن؟ ما فرص نجاح صفقة القرن؟ وهل تجسد هذه الصفقة إعادة هيكلة للترتيبات الأمنية والسياسية في منطقة الشرق الأوسط برمتها؟ ما الأهداف النهائية لكل من إيران وتركيا وإسرائيل في المنطقة؟ ما مستقبل دور كل من مصر وسوريا والعراق؟ وأخيراً، ما الفرص والمعوقات أمام دولة الإمارات لنجاح استراتيجيات الذكاء الاصطناعي وصناعة الفضاء والثورة الصناعية الرابعة؟ ستتم مقاربة القضايا التي تطرحها تلك الأسئلة في 10 جلسات على مدى يومين، بحيث تركز جلسات اليوم الأول على رسم خريطة القدرات العالمية، أما جلسات اليوم الثاني فتحاول استكشاف خريطة القوة في الشرق الأوسط. ويشارك في الجلسات 10 نخبة من أهل السياسة والفكر من مختلف أرجاء العالم. الجمع الكريم، منذ نشأة مركز الإمارات للسياسات في سبتمبر عام 2013 وهو يحقق في كل عام إنجازات جديدة، وتتوسع قائمة أعماله ونشاطاته، وتتطور برامجه ومخرجاته بحيث أصبح من أهم مراكز البحث والتفكير في المنطقة. وفي هذا العام يسرني أن أعلن عن إطلاق أكاديمية مركز الإمارات للسياسات، التي تعد الأكاديمية التدريبية الأولى من نوعها في المنطقة، والتي تقدم دورات تدريبية في مجال تحليل السياسات وبناء السيناريوهات ووضع الاستراتيجيات لصناع القرار باتباع أحدث المنهجيات العلمية. وأخيراً أود أن أتقدم ببالغ الشكر والعرفان إلى صناع القرار في دولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة، وعلى رأسهم صاحب السمو الشيخ محمد بن راشد آل مكتوم، نائب رئيس الدولة، رئيس مجلس الوزراء، حاكم دبي، وصاحب السمو الشيخ محمد بن زايد آل نهيان، ولي عهد أبو ظبي، نائب القائد الأعلى للقوات المسلحة بالدولة، وسمو الشيخ هزاع بن زايد، نائب رئيس المجلس التنفيذي لإمارة أبو ظبي، على دعمهم المتواصل للمركز وأعماله وتفاعلهم العميق مع أوراقه وتحليلاته وتوصياته. كما أتوجه بخالص الشكر والتقدير والامتنان إلى وزارة الخارجية والتعاون الدولي، ممثلة بسمو الشيخ عبدالله بن زايد آل نهيان ومعالي الدكتور أنور قرقاش، على دعمهما المتواصل للمركز ودورهما في إنجاح هذا الملتقى. ولا بد لي أيضا من شكر فريق المركز على اجتهاده وتفانيه الدائمين لتطوير المركز. ولا يفوتني أيضا أن أشكر كل صديق للمركز من مختلف أرجاء العالم قدم لنا أفكاراً أو زودنا باقتراحات لتطوير عملنا. كما لا يفوتني شكر شركائنا الإعلاميين وتحديداً قناة سكاي نيوز عربية، الشريك الإخباري الدولي، وشبكة العين الإخبارية، و7 Day News. ختاماً، إنه لمن دواعي سرورنا أن نستضيف كل عام معالي الدكتور أنور قرقاش وزير الدولة للشؤون الخارجية، وأدعو معاليه إلى التكرم بإلقاء الكلمة الرئيسية للملتقى، فليتفضل مشكور.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. مرحبا بكم في أبو ظبي. Excellencies, distinguished guests, I am delighted once again to be addressing this prestigious forum. Let me congratulate Dr. Abtisam Al-Kitbi and the Emirates Policy Center for organizing this event, an event that has established itself as a key fixture on foreign policy landscape in the Gulf. It's been another year of exceptional challenges in which we have witnessed some very challenging developments in the region. However, I now feel that there is reason for optimism, and our work is about optimism. We've reached critical junctures in major conflicts and challenges across our region. From Yemen to Libya to Iran, the next 12 months could be decisive. And the truth is that what always gives me most hope is seeing how the UAE continues to break new ground. Just this year, we have welcomed the Catholic Pope to the Arabian Peninsula for the first time, sent the first Emirati into space, and hosted the first ever Special Olympics in the Middle East. Next year, Expo 2020 will open in Dubai. It will be the first World Expo to be held in the region, and the largest event in the Arab world, with 192 countries participating. More importantly, it will reaffirm the UAE's ability to bring the world together and build cross-cultural understanding. Empowering women and enhancing the role of young people remains at the core of the UAE's priorities, and we have seen significant further progress this year. When our Federal National Council meets next month, 50% of its members will be women. And the Cabinet has decided that each government entity's board must include at least one person under the age of 30. This all adds up to a process of constant progressive evolution, driven by social, political, and economic innovation. Indeed, as we deal with various regional crises, it is vital that the UAE keeps evolving, not just for our own sake, but to give others hope that life really can get better in this region. Ladies and gentlemen, the various crises that we have seen recently in the region require careful management and serious-minded statesmanship. Amid the combination of the Iran-backed missile attacks on Saudi Arabia, the Turkish invasion of Syria, Israel's threats to annex Palestinian territories, popular unrest in Iraq and Lebanon, as well as ongoing conflicts in Yemen and Libya, there is very little room for missteps. This situation calls for cool heads, firm resolve, and dynamic diplomacy. It also calls for principled cooperation, not destructive competition between major powers. The choice facing us is too often wrongly presented as a binary one, between either conflict or capitulation. Constructive ideas are in short supply, but they are needed more than ever, because I believe that in the midst of these crises, there looms real opportunity. So when it comes to dealing with Iran, we should not fall for the false choice between war on the one hand or a flawed JCPOA on the other. Instead, this moment requires a renewed, robust, and realistic diplomatic effort to reach a more sustainable agreement. Iran's behavior remains a serious concern for other countries in the region. We do not seek confrontation, but cannot accept the aggressive nature of Iran's regional policy. However, further escalation at this point serves no one, and we strongly believe that there is room for collective diplomacy to succeed. The UAE has therefore sought to de-escalate tensions and help create awareness that this situation is neither sustainable nor beneficial to any party. My hope is that by taking this approach, we may create an opening for a meaningful political process. Such a process would need to address all the major security issues of concern to other countries in the region. These include Iran's interventions, both directly and through proxies, in other countries in the region, as well as its nuclear and ballistic missile programs. Given how we have seen Iran's use its ballistic missiles, it will be difficult for any meaningful talks not to address this. And critically this time, the Gulf states would need to be at the negotiating table. For such a process to work, it is essential that the international community is on the same page, especially the US and the EU, as well as the Arab Gulf states. And we would, of course, need to see an end to flagrant attacks such as that on the Aramco facility, which are unacceptable and serve only to undermine the diplomatic process. But I believe there could be a path to a deal with Iran that all parties might soon be ready to embark on. It will be long, and patience and courage will be required. Nevertheless, if Iran demonstrates it would be seriously committed to the process, I feel the conditions could be right to succeed. A deal resulting from such a process could revitalize Iran's economy and be a blueprint for a new, more stable regional order in which all countries will be able to thrive. Equally, the choice now on Yemen is not one between either endless conflict or abandoning the Yemeni people to the Houthis or Al-Qaeda. Instead, the situation calls for muscular diplomacy that can move us towards pragmatic, peaceful, and sustainable political solutions. That is the kind of diplomacy that I saw last week in Riyadh, where I was part of His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed's delegation at the signing of the Riyadh Agreement. After witnessing the signing of the Riyadh Agreement between the government of Yemen and the Southern Transitional Council, I was left with a sense of real optimism. The UAE is grateful for Saudi Arabia for facilitating this agreement and commends the government of Yemen and the STC for putting the interests of the Yemeni people first. The agreement solidifies the anti-Houthi coalition and provides a more robust basis for reaching a political solution. Now we need to build on the momentum that this has given us. Having redeployed our troops from Aden, the UAE's priorities within the coalition will be to continue to provide counter-terrorism activity as well as humanitarian aid and protect maritime security. We will also lend ongoing support to the government of Yemen and the UN in their efforts to achieve a sustainable political solution. The coalition has managed to defend its strategic priorities in Yemen. The Houthis have been prevented from taking over the country. The threat of Al-Qaeda has been degraded. The legitimate government of Yemen has started to rebuild. And while the geostrategic balance in the Arabian Peninsula was severely challenged, ultimately it has not been altered. However, the tragedy is that Yemenis have suffered greatly because of the refusal of the Houthis and their Iranian backers to comply with Security Council Resolution 2216. In order to alleviate the suffering of the Yemeni people, the UAE has provided nearly $6 billion in foreign aid since the conflict started, assisting 17.2 million Yemenis in 22 provinces. Continuing this humanitarian assistance will remain a priority for us. It is frankly all too easy for people to say that the coalition should not have intervened in Yemen, that we should have stood by as the Houthis violently overthrew the legitimate government, brought an abrupt end to the peaceful transition process, and then refused to comply with the UN Security Council's demand that they withdraw their forces. Would it have been better for the Yemeni people if we had left it to the Iranian-backed Houthi and Al-Qaeda to divide the country up? In my view, the answer is a resounding no. But the coalition has long been committed to finding a political solution to the conflict. Indeed, even before the present conflict, both Saudi Arabia and the UAE played a central role in developing the so-called GCC initiative, which provided the roadmap for Yemen to undergo a peaceful political transition. More recently, we have given strong and consistent support to the work of UN Special Envoy to Yemen, Martin Griffiths. The coalition kept the pressure on the Houthis precisely in order to facilitate the peace process, and we have fully supported the implementation of the Stockholm Agreement. Indeed, the UAE redeployed its forces away from Hodeidah in order to allow space for the agreement to work. We remain concerned at the slow progress on implementation of the Stockholm Agreement. But once it has been adequately implemented, the Yemeni people should urgently work towards a wider political agreement. Such an agreement must take account of the legitimate aspirations of all parts of Yemeni society. That includes the Houthis. Houthi militias have wreaked havoc on the country, but they are a part of the Yemeni society and they will have a role in its future. Any sustainable political solution in Yemen must also allow for adequate security assurances for neighboring states, including with regard to containing the terrorism threat, ensuring maritime security, and of course preventing attacks against its neighbors emanating from Yemen. The international community, and especially the UN Security Council, can be instrumental in helping to bring such a solution into being, and the UAE will certainly continue to play its part. As we tackle these urgent problems, we should use this period of crisis as an opportunity to start to build a new regional order. At the core of that order needs to be a respect for national sovereignty. This means an end to intervention as well as the threat of intervention from other states. The cost to the region of the multiple flagrant violations of state sovereignty has been way too high. We cannot have a stable order if countries like Iran or Turkey feel that they can freely intervene in other states, or indeed if some states live in fear of intervention from others. The Turkish invasion of northeastern Syria, for example, will continue to have negative humanitarian, security, and geopolitical implications, especially if it leads to prolonged Turkish presence on Syrian soil. Turkey risks becoming increasingly isolated from the Arab world and its NATO partners who want to see it return to being a stable and prosperous neighbor. The Arab world must not be treated as a geostrategic space over which its neighbors compete for influence. But in our region, building this culture of respect for national sovereignty is also intimately interlinked with our efforts to tackle transnational Islamist extremist ideologies. For it is in the nature of these ideologies, whether they be Sunni or Shia based, that they do not recognize the legitimacy of national borders. This is another reason that Turkey's recent actions are so unwelcome, as they risk reversing some of the progress we have made together in defeating Daesh. This new regional order also requires a strong multilateralism that can support the peaceful resolution of disputes. We need to be ready to act in unison to resolve conflicts between states and to encourage countries to resolve any internal conflicts through political dialogue. We have seen an example of this recently in Sudan. The African Union, as well as Saudi Arabia and the UAE, played a vital role in helping to steward Sudan through peaceful transition away from the oppressive regime of President Bashir and into a power-sharing government. This will now lead to elections and a civilian government. Our intentions on these issues are often lazily misrepresented in the media. Our interest in Sudan is not ideological. We are solely focused on helping it to avoid a chaotic and unruly transition and establish inclusive, moderate governance that will better respond to the aspirations of the Sudanese people, as well as support regional stability. In a similar fashion, the community of Arab states must be ready to provide support to Iraq and Lebanon as they seek to find peaceful, constitutional, and inclusive ways to manage the current challenges within their own countries. Regional support for Arab countries must not be influenced by sectarian considerations. The tendency of radical Islamist groups to label Shia Arab populations as somehow adversaries of Sunni Arabs must be countered at every step. Shia Arabs feel as proud of their national and their Arab identities as anyone else does. Therefore, this regional approach to maintaining peace and stability must have a strong, moderate Arab center at its core. And over time, we must strengthen the ability of regional multilateral institutions to contribute to this endeavor. But this new regional order will be hollow and short-lived unless it is underpinned by a renewal of Arab states and values. Peace and stability will only be sustainable if Arab governments can deliver for all their people's aspirations, whether young or old, Muslim or Christian, male or female. This is what we are committed to doing here in the UAE. Every day, new efforts are made to empower those people in society who have not always had as much opportunity as others, and to ensure they are able to play a full part in our collective success story. It is striking that what I honestly see day in, day out in my work is a leadership that is constantly preoccupied with practical questions of how to improve housing, healthcare, education, and employment. This should be the same right across the region. We have seen in the past how political unrest affects states in which citizens' aspirations are frustrated. This is what we are seeing again today in Iraq and in Lebanon. So we must work with regional partners to promote the rule of law, the empowerment of women and youth, human rights, and sustainable development. That is why the UAE is committed to providing aid and technical support to other countries in the region as they work towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goal. It is also why we recently launched the Arab Charter on Women's Rights in Abu Dhabi, as we must develop a clear code of conduct and ethics that is tailor-made for our region. And at the same time, it is imperative that we strive to spread a more tolerant culture across the region. This year has been named the Year of Tolerance in the UAE because we know that mutual respect and engagement enhance understanding and provide the foundation for greater peace and stability. The visit by His Holiness Pope Francis to the UAE last February was a truly historic moment, and the signing of the document on human fraternity by the Pope and the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar represented a courageous rejection of the politics of division. The UAE now has announced that it will be constructing the Abrahamic family house, in which a mosque, a church, and a synagogue will stand side by side in Abu Dhabi. These actions we are taking are not random. These actions we are taking are not random, isolated steps, but instead are part of a coherent, long-term vision that underpins the UAE's story. Together, they also reflect a distinctive vision for what a modern, revitalized region could be like. However, the future of the regional order cannot be entirely separated from the future of the global order. Sadly, the rise of populism, the preoccupation of Western countries with their own internal concerns, as well as growing divisions between the US, Europe, Russia, and China, mean that we are not getting the kind of coherent international leadership that we need in this region. Yet it is surely in the interest of all the world's major powers to see a region that is peaceful, economically dynamic, and ideologically moderate. They should therefore cooperate in support of building the kind of regional order I have described, instead of seeking narrow and short-sighted advantages for themselves. Thankfully, the blueprint for this already exists in the UN Charter, but we need to inject new life into the Charter in ways that will benefit this region. How can we do that? Firstly, the Security Council needs to more robustly enforce the principles enshrined in the Charter, as well as its own resolutions. This must include acting more consistently to address threats and interventions in violation of state sovereignty. And when the Council resolves to address threats to peace and security in this region, it is crucial that ensures enforcement by all member states. Unfortunately, it has often failed to do so, whether that be in Palestine, Yemen, or Syria, to name only a few examples. Of course, to strengthen its long-term effectiveness, the Council will also ultimately need to be reformed in order to be more reflective of the current balance of power in the world. Second, the Security Council needs to fully utilize Chapter 8 of the Charter and promote a greater involvement of regional organizations in the peaceful settlement of disputes. The Council should increase coordination and early consultation with the relevant regional and sub-regional players. They often possess the greatest understanding of the disputes and strongest interest in resolving them. The African Union is developing as a powerful example of how this can work, with the leading role it plays in resolving disputes in Africa, supported by the Security Council. Similar support should be extended to regional organizations and states in the Middle East. Third, the UN General Assembly needs to preserve and reinforce the progress we have achieved in promoting international norms on human rights, women's empowerment, and tolerance, as well as tackling common challenges such as climate change. The development of international norms and goals underpinned by a combination of international cooperation, peer pressure, and international obligations has undoubtedly supported progressive changes in the Middle East and around the world. It would be a tragedy if this progressive consensus and the cooperation envisaged in the UN Charter were to be undermined by the rise of a more fragmented world order. These principles are not radical or new, but by reinforcing them, the international community can provide more effective support for the development of a new regional order. And if the UAE is elected to a non-permanent seat on the Security Council in 2022, these are certainly some of the principles that will guide us. Ladies and gentlemen, the preamble of the UN Charter wisely commits member states to practice tolerance and live together in peace and with one another as good neighbors. Nearly 75 years after the Charter was signed, the spirit has never been so needed in this region. I believe there is an opportunity for positive change in the regional order, but the principles that should underpin this change need to be more consistently supported by world powers. Unlocking this kind of regional and international change will require creative diplomacy and true leadership. The UAE stands ready to contribute to the kind of leadership that this moment demands, one with the vision to build a new regional order that will provide security for all people and all nations, one that works tirelessly to unlock the talents of the region's men, women, and children, and one with a commitment to a modern, progressive Arab society that promotes tolerance of all people, whatever their faith or ethnicity. It is incumbent on every one of us to provide that kind of leadership and work together to build a region and a world that is fit for our grandchildren to inherit. Thank you very much.
في ملتقى أبوظبي الاستراتيجي لهذا العام نتحاور حول عودة المنافسات القديمة بين القوى الرئيسة في السياسة الدولية. منافسات تتخذ أشكالاً عدة، ابتداءً من دور التكنولوجيا في توزيع القوة العسكرية في العالم، إلى خريطة العالم الجيومالية الجديدة، بينما يظل التنافس على الطاقة ساحة للصراع بين القوى الدولية. القدرات التكنولوجية والسبرانية وخاصة الذكاء الاصطناعي تبرز كمحدد رئيس من محددات قواعد اللعبة الدولية. وتطمح السياسات في دولة الإمارات إلى سبر أغوار الفضاء انطلاقا من إيمانها بأن الابتكار هو محرك الازدهار. النسخة السادسة لملتقى أبوظبي الاستراتيجي تطرح أسئلة موضوعية عن توزع القوة في الشرق الأوسط، القوة الخشنة والقوة الناعمة وقوة الذكاء الاصطناعي. أحد مدارات نقاشاتنا هي منطقة الخليج العربي بقدراتها واحتمالات تكيفها في هذا العصر. حوارنا سيمتد من صفقة القرن التي تسعى لإعادة كتابة اللعبة الإقليمية في العصر الجديد، إلى إيران التي تتحدى النظام الدولي مخلفة بذلك انعكاسات سلبية داخلية وإقليمية، وتركيا التي باتت وكأنها في طريقها إلى خسارة لعبة التنافس الإقليمي بسبب سياسات القوة المتخيلة، وإسرائيل التي تسعى لصياغة قواعد اللعبة الإقليمية لصالحها. نتطرق إلى مصر التي تراهن على دور إقليمي إيجابي، والعراق الذي قد يكون لأهمية جيوستراتيجية دور حاسم في تغيير قواعد اللعبة، في الوقت الذي تظل فيه سوريا مسرحاً للتنافسات الدولية والإقليمية في العصر الجديد. أجندة ملتقى أبوظبي الاستراتيجي ثرية بمواضيع وتثرى أكثر كل عام بنقاشات وحواركم البناء، فأهلا وسهلا.
Dear speakers and moderators, could you please kindly come to the main stage for a photo group? Thank you. المتحدثين ومدراء الجلسات الأكارم أرجو الحضور إلى المنصة لأخذ صورة جماعية. شكرا.
Let me say one thing.
The next panel starts in 5 minutes. The next panel starts now. The next panel starts now.
Greetings, everyone. If I can ask you to take your seats. I am Steve Clemens. I'm editor-at-large of an American public policy publication called The Hill. It's terrific to be with all of you today, and we have an outstanding panel this morning to discuss the global military gap, distribution, and militarization of the war of technology. That is a lot of jargon to basically talk about what does power look like in the world today. And we have just a really outstanding set of three people here to discuss that issue. Let me introduce them. First, we have, just to my left, someone who's a real legend in the area of international security, intelligence, energy, and threats. Anthony Cordesman is the Arleigh Burke Chair in Strategy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He was the former Director of Intelligence Assessment at the Department of Defense. He's someone I've looked to really for decades for what I would call no BS assessments of what's going on in the world. So I'm really pleased to be on the stage with Anthony Cordesman. And Ambassador Boris Ruga, Vice Chairman of the Munich Security Conference, a former ambassador of Germany to Saudi Arabia, a former Deputy Chief of Mission in Washington, D.C. It's great to see you again and to be with you here as well. And then Marc Finaud is a former French diplomat. He's now head of proliferation at the Geneva Center for Security Policy. Terrific discussion. What I'm looking for today, gentlemen, I'm going to start with you, Tony, is to help give a broad overview and sort of a strategic map of the way we look at military trends and military power today. But I want to start it with a sort of out of left field question for a moment as the preamble to this discussion. And that is, we're sitting right at the point at the fall of the Berlin Wall 30 years ago. And I'm interested in the question is, as you tell us what the map looks like today from your perspective, what have we learned or not learned about military power and the way we think about war at this important historic point, looking back as we begin to look forward at what nation states are doing with military power today? Tony?
I think that the problem has almost nothing to do with the Berlin Wall. We've learned from many different types of conflicts, some of them here in the Gulf, some of them which are essentially the product of instability internally in many countries. I think when we talk about military technology, we have to remember that you have people in Iraq shooting their own citizens at the moment, and the technology of dealing with popular unrest in some ways is more immediate than the risk of total war. This is the kind of change that's occurred since that issue. I think as an introduction to the global problem, one difficulty most of us have is we've never looked at the actual changes in Russia. It didn't begin with the Berlin Wall, it began with the events that led to it. But Russia essentially is a much smaller power than it was at the fall of the Berlin Wall. It has had very little actual economic development. It is, at this point in time, a minor power compared to China, which at the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall was roughly the same as Russia. Arguably, China today is at somewhere 70% of the GDP of the United States, although there are many different ways to define it. Another way is to look at total military spending, which in many ways is an indication of how much military technology you can actually buy and use. The U.S. is pretty close to $700 billion this year in military spending. China's figures are arguable. Some estimates put them as low as something around 190 billion, some as high as 220 to 250. If you look at the estimates from most research centers for Russia, it's somewhere around 62 to 64 billion. And it's mildly amusing when you talk about the NATO burden sharing issue, which certainly seems to paralyze the alliance occasionally, that by those same estimates, NATO Europe alone is spending roughly 4 times as much on military forces collectively as Russia is. Now, spending is not always a measure of capability. If that was true, the Gulf Arab states are spending about 12 times as much on defense at a minimum as Iran. Some estimates would put it at 25 times. If you look at the actual arms imports, and I'm not talking about the deal of the century, which I hope this forum will conclude is a totally absurd political gesture on the part of our president. What is real is that in the Department of Defense estimates, you have the Gulf Arab states importing about 20 times as many arms as Iran has been able to, and with far better access to weapons. What's interesting about those figures, which I quoted for the superpowers, is people somehow have the impression, and I'll leave this to my colleagues, that we are watching a world in which people are spending more on military forces than they were at the time that the wall fell. In constant dollars, the CIPRI and IISS, and I suspect US official estimates, are that it's a minor increase collectively for all the countries other than the United States, Russia, and China. And when it really comes down to that military spending, it has not begun to keep up with the increase in the economies, the GDPs of the developing countries. So rather than having a massive move toward military technology, you have something very different. And let me just close with this. In spite of the massive increases in Chinese military spending, their military forces in personnel are less than a third of what they were in the time that the wall fell. They have cut virtually every aspect of weapons numbers, but they have vastly improved the number of advanced and competitive systems. The same's true of Russia, it's true of the United States, and one of the few common denominators in Europe is the more that they actually spend under these equipment and GDP goals, the more they tend to actually cut their force numbers. What you see is basically a very poor correlation there. I guess I'd just close. There is some coherence in the Gulf. Please, if you are here in the Gulf, do not have the impression that exists in Asia, Africa, or Latin America. There are no regional patterns. Countries differ so much in their capability, their spending levels, and what they are buying relative to threats, that the more you look at the regions, the less order and structure you see.
Thank you so much, Tony. Mark, let me jump over to you for a minute. Tony said a lot, but among the things he said is that spending, that the aggregate volume of weapons acquisition doesn't necessarily translate into power. And so what is, as you look at the strategic global map of power today, what do you see?
Well, thank you. First, if I may, just a disclaimer, and I really have to say that I hate being on an all-male panel, so I will report you to the director of the Emirates Policy Center. And second, that I had anticipated to impress you with a lot of graphs and tables with a lot of figures, and fortunately you have been spared with this PowerPoint. So I would just mention a couple of points which actually go really along what Tony said. Well, first, when we talk about military spending, I think what we have in mind is everything is relative. Okay, the total estimate of military spending by CIPRI is close to 2 trillion, 1.8 trillion last year. Now, if you compare this with world GDP, this is around 2.1%. So you could argue it's not a lot, but of course, again, situations vary dramatically depending on which country you're talking about or which region. Now, if you look at the whole list of world countries, 41 states are above this average of 2.1%, and it doesn't mean that these are the richest countries. Because actually, if you take OECD, the group of the richest countries, they are exactly at this average of 2.1%. Now, some countries are really above average, and this includes Saudi Arabia, for instance, close to 9%, Israel, close to 5%, Russia, 4%, US at above 3%. Now, if you look at the regional spending, this is obviously where you find out that there's one region that spends much more than the others. Of course, this is the Middle East and North Africa. In terms of GDP, it's around 5.5%. Now, in volume, again, this is a completely different picture because you see two countries which are the top spenders, which are US and China. Together, they spend half of the world military spending, which means that all the rest is spread, is ventilated among a lot of countries. Now, if you take another criterion, which is military spending per capita, again, you find some countries which are similar than the previous ones, such as Saudi Arabia, US, Israel, which are in the top three. But then all the rest, you have, of course, much lower figures. And if you take another criterion, which is military spending as share of government spending compared to all the other areas, such as education, etc., the world average is almost 6.3%. And there you see some countries which are much more spending much more in terms of government than anyone else. Saudi Arabia comes second, almost 25%.
Right.
Oman, 20%. Jordan, 15%. So again, that shows a diversity of situations. And then I may come back to beyond spending, obviously, how this translates into military forces, because here again we see a very diversified picture.
Thank you. Boris, I want to go to you, but I do want to point out to the audience that despite what you may see, that is not Tony Cordesman, that is Ambassador Ruga, and this is Tony Cordesman, because the names are mislabeled in front of you, but it is what it is. But Ambassador, as you give us your strategic map and tell us, particularly, you said the Munich Security Conference, which is sort of the oasis that everyone runs to every year to talk about these things. What I'd like to add into the mix to have you share with us is not just the formal. I sometimes wonder when we ask these questions, are we asking the right questions? When you think about power, you think about spending, you think about how nations today look at power as opposed to how they did so perhaps during the Cold War. What are the other elements of power that you think we should be considering beyond military spending? So your map.
Thanks, Steve. And let me just say it's a pleasure to be here. And thank you to Dr. Ibtisam for having me and for increasing the cooperation. We signed a little agreement yesterday, increasing cooperation between EPC and the Munich Security Conference. Since I'm German and since I flew in from Berlin yesterday, let me just sort of go back, and I think it may be helpful for our conversation, to 1989. I joined the German Foreign Service in May of 1989, 6 months before the wall came down.
Right.
And of course, at the time, no one had the faintest idea that the wall would come down, but it did. And I think that does not relate to military balances, perhaps, but it does relate to something that you could call strategic surprise. And that's something to be kept in mind. Sometimes big events creep up on us. And
not to interrupt, I would ask whether it's strategic surprise or strategic accomplishment.
Yeah, true. It's one man's strategic surprise is another man's strategic accomplishment, I would say. I would perhaps answer your question by quoting President Macron and his notorious interview. I think that plays into that. And the quote goes like this. He's talking about the Europeans here. If we don't wake up, there's a considerable risk that in the long run, we will disappear geopolitically, or at least we will no longer be in control of our destiny. And I think he's right on the money with that quote. I think there's a real issue for Europe in terms of the European Union and its member states maintaining their position. Where I disagree and where my government disagrees quite strongly with President Macron is with regard to NATO, his statement on NATO. We feel very strongly that we need to stick with the United States of America, that we need to keep NATO strong, and that is our best bet in a very complex world that is changing very rapidly, where military balances are perhaps more relevant than they have been, where technology is changing, and with the evolution of technology, power balances are also shifting, that we need to stick together as Europeans and Americans. Perhaps that answers your question a little bit.
It does. It does. We've had at this Abu Dhabi Strategic Dialogue in the past, and we may have in this, I'm not sure, Eftisam has always had a provocative panel on Russia's strategic interests, on China's strategic interest. And as we've done these in past years, there's been no doubt, at least from my conversations with Russian strategic thinkers and Chinese strategic thinkers here in Abu Dhabi, that they see America today in strategic contraction. Much of the rest of the world in this room have talked about how Russia has become more of a force making change happen in this region. And so I want to just challenge you just to go a little bit deeper with that, Ambassador Ruga, and ask you, as the world may want the United States to play that, well, what if the United States doesn't want to be that role? Because right now, when you listen to President Trump, who apparently wants to go to the May Day parade and hang out with President Yeltsin, but if that trend continues, is it a smart bet for the rest of the world to count on that dimension of power from the U.S., or do they actually need to begin bulking up? So we're not only talking about military power and how it's aggregated today, but in a world that is less of a world particularly of alliances with the U.S., does that leave nations in this situation that what we've been seeing, and one of the presuppositions of this panel is that there's a lot of military spending, a lot of acquiring of things in the defense space going on. Won't that skyrocket if current trends continue?
So I think colleagues to my left and right are much more knowledgeable about some of the detail, but it seems evident to someone like me that Chinese military spending and Chinese capabilities mean that the United States of America will have to invest much more strongly diplomatically and militarily in Asia. So Europeans are well advised to become more capable looking after their own strategic interests. I think the reality is and remains that we cannot look after our own security needs without the United States of America backing us up. But the reality is also that the United States of America, and it's very evident when you look at the U.S. Congress, that has been taking a somewhat different line from President Trump, and that has been turning up in large numbers at the Munich Security Conference, I think, to make a point, which is that they want to keep the alliance with Europe strong. The U.S. has an interest, which is to be present in Europe in order to prevent Europe from being dominated by outside powers, specifically Russia, but perhaps China also, and that the United States of America can use the bases it has in Europe and the military infrastructure it has in Europe to project power. So I think there's a very strong American interest to remain present in Europe, despite what President Trump says. I think on our part, our homework is to become more capable allies, to be able to look after more of our security portfolio, but not to the detriment of the alliance.
Thank you. Tony Kortesman, I think it was about a decade ago I visited you in your office. I was visiting Dr. Brzezinski as well as Zbigniew Brzezinski, whose son Mark is sitting right here in the front. It's a great honor to see Mark Brzezinski here. And we were having a conversation about Iran and Israel. And at the time, you had incredible graphs and charts, which I could show today, and I remember it like it was yesterday, where you talked about, let's take a real look about which country could truly wipe the other off the map. And your argument to me at that time was that Israel's capacity was so staggeringly large in the nuclear area that Iran was the one that was vulnerable at that time. And I think this dovetails with some of your comments just now, that within the Gulf region, perhaps a 25-to-1 ratio of spending between this region and Iran. And then you talked about other disparities as well. And I just want to ask you to help us understand, why do you think it is that we don't look at a nation's aggregate power in terms of military spending as power? Why are some states, even like Russia, which have such a lesser capacity, nonetheless looked at as the threats they are today?
Well, first, I think one problem we all face is there is no single parameter that you can use to judge military power. Most of the countries in the world are relatively small. They may have minor frictions with their neighbors. Their primary problem is stabilizing their own military and dealing with their own internal security. That is a reality that it's easy to forget when we focus on the superpowers. And it depends very much on the region. There are some countries, which I guess I'm old enough to have lived and watched, that have been magnificently unstable and self-destructive, like the Congo, for more than half a century. Nothing really ever seems to help. And I certainly hope that things go better in Yemen, but when I first visited this region, Yemen was a mess, and it has had a few years in between in which it wasn't. And I'm not quite as optimistic as it's to its future. So these are part of the aspects of military power. You mentioned Russia. Russia draws on an immense pool of equipment and a vast technology base. And it has a great advantage over China in terms of proven technological capability and productivity, not because of its current economics, but because of its history and what Russia inherited from the former Soviet Union. You mentioned the changes here in the Gulf. I think it's obvious that most of us did not predict how quickly Iran would go to precision strike capabilities. Before it struck at Abqaiq, I think most people were still focusing on ballistic missiles. They shouldn't have, given what had already come out of Yemen. But you also have to remember that regardless of what the Gulf states have spent, with all due respect, the Gulf Arabs have created a military mess. There is some degree of unity between the UAE and Saudi Arabia. There are major asymmetries in the capability of their individual military services. The Gulf Cooperation Council, in many ways, is in kind of a race with ASEAN to see which can be the least effective alliance and divide most among its members. And then you look at what has Iran done. In addition to its nuclear efforts, it's developed a very effective missile force. It has developed very effective asymmetric forces in terms of air-sea missile capability. And to be blunt, in many cases, Arab navies are little more than a facade when they have spent a great deal of money on ships which are not exactly what they should have bought at any point in the threat. So there is here the issue of capability. And military power is also, let's be blunt, a subject of gray area operations. If Arab states divide against each other, they are issuing Iran and Russia or Turkey an open invitation to exploit those divisions. Now, should the U.S. do more? Should it stay here? Should it support its Arab partners? Yes. But where does the primary responsibility for failure really lie? It's not in the United States. It is within the GCC states, and in many ways within the Arab world.
Thank you. Mark, I want to ask you to go a little bit further as well, as I know at the Geneva Center, in fact, I was looking at your Twitter account today, and the pride you take in things like the NPT treaty, but in the age of treaties that seem to me to be coming undone, the INF treaty being upended, I'm interested in what, if you were to be given a lot of power in negotiating and dealing with great powers that seem to be back in the game and thinking about how we need to collectively begin to try to manage this, what would you be putting on the table?
Well, the first challenge, especially if you compare to the period of the Cold War, obviously was that at that time there was a bipolar world, which was more or less based on strategic stability, and both powers were trying to, always in a race, contain and avoid getting over the adversaries. Now, of course, it's challenging because you have so many actors, and the framework for maintaining strategic stability, as you said, is unraveling. So the challenge is how to contain this new arms race, which has many more runners than used to be the case, and which has a main risk which poses to world security, which is to lower the threshold of use of nuclear weapons. Now, we hear mutual threats between India and Pakistan, because precisely India has huge conventional superiority over Pakistan, and Pakistan wants to equalize this with nuclear weapons. This is what France did towards the Soviet Union or the UK during the Cold War. So there is now this trend to look for possibly nuclear weapons as an equalizer against conventional forces. And even...
So you believe we're going to get more proliferation?
Yes, of course, because the big powers give the example, that they not only they didn't abide by their promise to reduce the forces and disarm, they were celebrating 50 years of the NPT. 50 years later, where is the situation compared to 50 years ago? We are in a new arms race, and therefore, of course, when you put yourselves in the shoes of the leaders of Iran, look at North Korea. North Korea achieved what it wanted, to be recognized as a legitimate partner, but only after exploding nuclear weapons. If you look at the case of Iraq or Libya, they were invaded after they renounced nuclear weapons. So again, that raises a lot of questions, and it creates an incentive among some countries that are tempted now to go nuclear.
So Mark, I want to give you an opportunity to be the headline tomorrow in the National. So what do you see about proliferation in the Gulf region?
Well, again, there is a risk, because if, the risk is self-fulfilling prophecy. We've been saying, okay, look at Iran, they want to have nuclear power and to use for a nuclear weapon. And if we maintain this policy of maximum pressure, sanctions, isolation, and possibly military action, as it was considered some time ago, then we give Iran a perfect excuse to go all the way to nuclear weapons, because they feel that that's the only way to protect their security.
So headline is Iran is on the way to nuclear weapon.
Not necessarily. It depends very much on what the rest of the world does. But if we push Iran to that situation, obviously this will create the domino effect that we all fear.
Tony, you wanted to respond.
I don't know if it's a response, but one problem you have is anyone here can go to the web and call up a map of the desalination plants in the Gulf.
Right.
If you hit those with a precision conventional weapon, you don't need a nuclear weapon to have massive population effects. When we talk about the future and you talk about the value of petroleum facilities, when you talk about the ability to knock out potable water supplies in urban areas. Exactly why you escalate to nuclear weapons or need nuclear weapons is somewhat problematic. 20 years ago, if you asked me, I would have said it would probably be about 2 more generations before you could get really good genetically engineered bioweapons. I don't think I'd say that today. If you talk about cyber, one of the questions is, if countries continue to invest in vulnerable systems, they create another type of weapon of mass effectiveness. So one thing we have to rethink is proliferation. It doesn't have to be nuclear anymore.
Thank you. Boris, let me add another layer of complexity to this, and we're going to go to the audience soon, and I want to remind people that you can let Dr. Ebtissam know you want to ask questions by indicating that you want to ask a question. I will be told which of you I can call on. But Boris, I want to add a level of complexity to this. We're on the really precipice of a new age of 5G, of quantum computing, of AI, of autonomous things, of going from 1 million connected devices per square mile in some parts of the United States versus 4,000 to today. We're seeing investment by China and the US in things that sound scary, very Terminator-like, lethal autonomous weapons systems. And so the whole new layer of military capacity and intelligence being brought to bear on these questions. And I'm interested in what you think our blind spots are today in terms of thinking about security and power. And Tony laid out the great powers and what they're doing, but is there an opportunity with what's coming for smaller powers to leapfrog and to gain mass when it comes to power that they wouldn't otherwise be able to have without these things that create extensive power?
I guess that depends, right? It depends on where you find yourself on the map, for example, and it depends on whether you can marshal the resources, whether there is a kind of ecosystem, if you like, from which you can operate. So if your immediate security is somehow looked after by a great power, for example, and you're able to develop these capabilities, then that puts you in a position where you can project power and play a role. But if your national security becomes threatened directly, that calculus changes. I think from a European perspective, if I may, and speaking as a German, I think perhaps our blind spot is precisely in the military field. Right? And much has been said and written about this. German attitudes towards military power, lack of strategic culture in Germany. And so the way we look at these things is quite different from the UK and France, similar countries in terms of their size and their resources. So I think we would be wise to take very seriously military power in this new age into which we're entering, number one. Number two, I think at the European level, the level of the European Union, we would be wise to invest very strategically into some of the key technologies, including artificial intelligence. I remember President Putin saying, I think back in 2017, something to the effect, he who masters artificial intelligence will be sort of the leading power. We know that the Communist Party of China has identified AI as a critical technology. So I think Europe should get there. Europe should also maintain, in my view, the know-how, the ability when it comes to 5G technology. And we actually have the businesses in Europe who can do this, right? There's not just Huawei, there's also European companies who can provide critical 5G architecture.
You have Ericsson and Nokia, but you don't have the financial muscle behind them that a Huawei does. I mean, I agree with you, I just want to kind of be very clear that...
Absolutely, but I think we have something with which we can work, so let's work with it. And as we speak in Germany, there's a public debate that is happening inside the government coalition and happening through the parliamentary groups in the Bundestag that's talking about what do we do on 5G and how do we maintain the ability to be a player in that regard.
Tony, what do you think about the coming age, this AI? Is this going to look like any other military transition in the past, or is there something special and unique about what's coming ahead? And is it going to heat up competition?
I don't know if it's going to heat up competition. I think the fact is that we compete, and we have competed. You mentioned the Berlin Wall. We've been competing all of my adult life, and I dimly think that Europe was competing long before there was a United States, although I may be wrong since I wasn't around back then. I think we do face more than what people talk about with AI or 3G or 5G or any of the others. In some ways, we're in the middle of an industrial revolution, as serious as the first one. We are watching automation, autonomous systems, the capability to manage technology, to go into forms of manufacturing, both civil and military, to link. And this is, I think, an interesting case in China. There's exactly one country I know that is a major power that directly links military and civil technology at virtually every level, and that's China. It certainly isn't the United States or any country in Europe, and frankly, Russia's structure right now is not making the kind of sense it should. These are shifts that are going to shape a great deal of the future, and I suspect if we had this meeting 25 years from now, we would be living in a fundamentally different economy in many ways, which would raise the question for all of us. Who creates jobs? What are the jobs? And how do they fit into international competition? And is there anyone here today that could remotely predict how serious those changes would be?
We'll give that to Ed Luce in the next panel. Ed from the Financial Times is moderating the next subject on the geoeconomic forces ahead. Mark, when you think about this coming age of technological transition and what it looks like, I'm interested in whether or not you think when you think ahead, say 25 years ahead, who will be, as you see it, particularly when you look at the Middle East region, but who will be the leaders? Who will survive this period of time to sort of prevail the way you see the trends in security going?
Well, of course, it's a good question. I think that first we have to keep in mind that, as Tony said, there's always been this technological race, and of course, technology can be applied for peaceful civil uses and also for hostile uses. The good news is that compared to the period of the Cold War, when it was the offset of military investment and research that had civilian applications such as the internet or microwave, etc. Now it's the other way around, is that most companies and states invest in civil technologies. The most, let's say, profitable and extensive source of applications today is video games. Okay, we all have that on our phones. The touch screens, the facial recognition, this all comes from investment in something as trivial as video games. And that may also have, of course, applications and extensions for military uses. Now, the question is whether it's enough to invest in these technologies to increase power. Now, obviously, this is not the case because we can see that this is only part of a broad picture, and states which succeed more are those which have an open society with freedom of expression, freedom of decision to invest and to make profit, while the powerful states like China certainly have the capacity to mobilize resources, probably for both civil and military applications. But in the end, they will run towards this dilemma of, whether society can really have its say.
Well, I'm glad you put that on the table, and I'll make this the last question I have for all of you, and then we'll go to our audience. Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft, has a new book out. It's just come out in the last several weeks called Tools and Weapons. And it's about AI, it's about facial recognition software, about these new digital tools, and says, it's the first time I've ever seen a senior technology executive be introspective and say, we can be dangerous. We can create the weapons of the future. And I think it's a very important admonition that we're getting, a warning. And he's basically saying that we need to understand the power of this coming age of technological advancement because it could be harnessed very quickly by bad players. And we need to do something, or governments need to. And so let me just go to each of you and ask, Brad Smith has put this challenge out there about tools and weapons and what's coming. Tony, what do you think, given your experience and the advice that you've given governments before, but as you look at China, we see China not slowing down in applying these areas and social controls or bringing them into the military. And you see, I think, some skepticism that this should be made part of at least the American matrix, if you will, of this. But what would be your counsel, Tony, in terms of should we do what China's doing, or should we create a demarcation there and play differently?
Well, it's a very good question, and it goes a lot further, because there's nobody from a Gulf state in this room that isn't aware of how dangerous the internet and social networking can be in terms of extremism and spreading messages which basically encourage terrorism and extremism. It's already a major challenge. I think that governments have to fight this, but they have to fight it in ways which preserve the support and confidence of their people. And if you look at surveys, there are quite a number of Gulf states that have that public support. If you look more broadly at things like the Arab Barometer, there are broad levels of distrust in other countries, and some countries in the Gulf, which are going to be very serious areas for exploitation, and in some ways already are. And you mentioned China. I was with a congressional group in China 3 weeks ago, and what really impressed me was not the meeting, it was being in a country where they have mastered the skill of linking a credit card to your political position. And if you criticize the government, you may lose the credit and the ability to move, or everything you do and buy is going to be flagged by the government. So let me just reverse your question. If George Orwell was writing 1984 today, what would that book look like?
Great question. Boris.
I was pleased to hear Minister Gargash talk about multilateralism and working together in the UN Charter. And when it comes to these new systems, lethal autonomous weapon systems, for example, there's a lot of interest in Europe in devising mechanisms for arms control of one sort or another. And you can say perhaps there's too much of a focus on trying to regulate these things. But I think, generally speaking, from a European point of view, on the one hand, we should be clear-eyed about the realities out there and possibly a new age of competition, great power competition, where military power becomes perhaps more relevant in some ways than it has been. But I think at the same time, we should double down and see what is possible in terms of arms control, because otherwise we are looking at a gigantic waste of resources that are needed for the development of humanity, right? And there's something out there, which is climate change, and that is going to pose an enormous challenge. So whatever we can do at the regional level or at the global level in order to prevent arms races in these new areas, in order to prevent nuclear proliferation, in order to put a cap on some of these things, that would be very good.
Mark?
Yes, and I fully agree. There are two key frameworks. That's multilateralism, and in Geneva, of course, we are very happy to host this kind of conversation, which is multi-stakeholder, which of course requires the presence and contribution of industry, but also civil society. And the other issue is that precisely industry can show the example. We had the case of workers at Google who refused to work for a Pentagon program on autonomous lethal weapons. And this is a good sign because that shows that civil society can take the initiative, has a power to influence the general conversation. And coming back to China.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but I want to. I know you're a peacemaker and you're thinking about this, and some of Google's employees don't want to work on lethal autonomous weapon systems, but others will.
Yes.
So the question is, if you have a divided world, where part of the world wants facial recognition software at every crosswalk and connected to every credit card, and others don't, do you end up with a split internet? Do you have a split system? Do you have a split world of 5G? That's where we're at today, and so it has very big implications for security, for society, across a lot of dimensions. So I just want to just challenge you in your role in Geneva of how do you wrestle the side of the equation that doesn't want to play nice?
Well, that's the same dilemma as proliferation. Do you want more countries to have nuclear weapons, or do you want those who have nuclear weapons to get rid of them? And that's the power, the potential power of multilateralism, is that you isolate those who may have bad intentions, and right. The pressure will be stronger if it's based on civil society and as many countries as possible.
Thank you. Let's go to the audience. We're going to take these in clusters of questions and then give an opportunity to our folks to respond. But let's start with Zafar Al-Ajmi. Your microphone should be on.
Yes. Thank you. My name is Dr. Zafar Al-Ajmi. I'm from Kuwait. Last year in December, I was delivering a paper and with the presence of Mr. Tony Kordsman, and I mentioned that the GCC Air Forces have Charlie Cube I. I'm trying to connect this with the technology, he said, and the military might that we try to get, and we end up with a military mess. I said, we have the Charlie Cube I. He said, you don't. And now I have to agree with him. So the Americans do have the Charlie Cube I all over the Gulf, in Rafjan, Kuwait, in Doha, in Abu Dhabi, and also in the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain. How did the cruise missiles and the drones from Iran sneak and attack our oil installations last 3 months? How can you explain that? I mean, isn't it supposed that the U.S. should honor its agreements instead of just focusing in selling armament?
Thank you for that. Let's go to Nabil Fahmy, or I'm sorry, Odeh Aberdeen. Odeh?
Right here.
Nice to know you're out there somewhere, my friend.
Hello, my friend, right here. Steve? All right. My question is to Tony Kordsman. Since you're the foremost military analyst in DC, and I have followed you for 40 years, when you look at the Gulf and the challenges they face, do they have a grand strategy? Secondly, it seems despite all the weapons sales we have sold to the GCC countries, right after the deal with Iran, strategic fear developed. Is that a rational fear or an irrational fear?
Thank you very much. Nabil Fahmy.
Thank you, Steve.
Greetings.
Hi, how are you, Steve? First of all, it's a very good beginning to the conference. Congratulations. Well, what you've been saying is, I think, in one sense, obvious. Spending money on arms does not necessarily get you power or security. It's actually how you spend it, not how much you spend. And it's more on the systems complementing each other. But it's not even only on the hardware. The other point I'd like to make is that the message I draw from what you've all been saying here is whether it's the Gulf states or North Africa and the Middle East, you need to depend on yourself much more in terms of your security vis-a-vis your day-to-day regional relationships because they are not existential threats that will bring in the major powers in one way or the other. And I think that's a message that doesn't start with Donald Trump, frankly. Obama first said that he's going to pivot to Asia, and it caused concerns in the Middle East and as well as in Asia and other places. But that's where America's been going for a while. And it's what I'm hearing from you is depend on yourself some more, engage each other, develop security arrangements. And Tony made the point that also you need to have more inter-Arab coherence to develop a political balance. My last point is on whether Iran will go nuclear or not. I don't actually think it has to go nuclear. It just plays the nuclear card. It played the nuclear card to get the JCPOA and get recognition internationally and acceptance of policies which were hegemonic throughout the region. Now, withdrawing from the JCPOA is even worse. So you end up with first condoning Iran and then now leaving the situation completely in limbo rather than trying to build on JCPOA. So they will play this card. I'm not sure they actually need nuclear weapons to imbalance security in the Gulf, definitely, or in the Middle East, but they may need it vis-a-vis big powers like the US. I will simply conclude that, again, we need to depend on ourselves more, but we need to have relations with the major players internationally, and we need to have some confidence that these major players will not shift policies at the spur of the moment without due notice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nabu. Let's take one more for this cluster. Bajat Korani. Hello.
Yes. Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, terrific. I don't see you, but I hope you see us.
Okay. My question really is related to the title of this first panel, the military map. And we have been submitted to some very important statistics. One, that military expenditure is higher than during the Cold War. However, to understand the significance of this expenditure, we need to understand the driving force, the strategic vision. So can perhaps some of the panelists specifically tell us about the strategic vision of one of the alliance systems that survived the Cold War, NATO?
Thank you.
Two, since we are talking about the 21st century as Asian, also a word on China's strategic vision. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Tony, I want to start with you. Let me just do a quick recap that will be unfair to everyone. Zafar asked about the cruise missiles from Iran, about why isn't America playing a larger role in notifying allies and communicating on this form of intelligence, I think was that question. Ode Abedin asked about the Gulf Grand Strategy, about weapons in this region and strategic fear. Nabil Fahmy made the comment about self-reliance in the region and a point I find very interesting because you can think about it at the other side of the world in Japan. If Iran is trying to be a nuclear Japan, which is nuclear power 6 months away from a bomb, that's different than a nuclear weapon, and I'm just sort of interested. It's a very interesting point. And then this other comment, which you addressed earlier, Tony, on the question of military expenditure in the aggregate globally, my impression was you actually said that in some cases, on a percentage of GDP basis, we actually weren't doing as much spending. So there's a bit of a tension there. And then largely about China's grand strategy and vision. So let me give you the first hit at this, and then we'll move down the aisle.
I think the question about missile defense, we could have done better, but It only would have mattered if somebody had been willing to listen. We have been on missile defense design and issues since the time of Tony Zinni. There is no country here that is not aware that Iran was able to buy the KH-55 and was working on cruise and on other forms of low-altitude flight systems. Saudi Arabia had already been attacked by such systems. And one of the problems you have throughout here is you not only haven't properly integrated the land-based air defenses, you haven't made the choices on cruise missiles, and you haven't developed a common architecture. Now, all of that reinforces the point that Nabil Fahmy made. We can help and we can suggest, but we are not here to plan and create the unity that is necessary for these systems to be effective. Oda Aberdeen's question, I think, is very valid. Iran is a real threat. But when it comes down to doing net assessments of where that threat really matters, how to counter it, what your mutual vulnerabilities are, and what your real-world priorities are for cooperation, that is the responsibility of the Gulf states, the Gulf Arab states. There's only so much that can be done from the outside. Now, I think in all fairness, I should make the point that Asia is no happier with our sort of tilt toward Asia than people are here with the occasional announcements of American withdrawal. But I'd be very careful about those announcements because we just got through with probably one of the most intense air campaigns in terms of counterinsurgency and counterterrorism in military history. And when it came down to who flew those sorties, it wasn't here that provided most of the aircraft. The military balance and strategic vision, the problem is strategic vision depends still more on anything else on relationships between countries and how they are spread within the immediate areas of confrontation. There is no single strategic vision. I thought we heard a very good description of the problems that Germany, France, and Britain have in NATO. But that bears no resemblance to the needs in the northern flank of NATO. And you didn't have the opportunity to mention all of the problems in the almost complete lack of progress in the southern flank, not to mention the minor issue of Turkey. When you talk about strategic trends on a global basis, almost by definition, you are wasting everybody's time. Because it's the trends that actually lead to the potential use of force, to military buildups and actual transfers of technology that matter, and none of those are global.
Thank you. Boris.
Comment on Anthony's last remark, with a possible exception of a technology such as AI and the applications. That would perhaps be a global strategic trend. No?
It's a global problem. It's not a strategy.
It's not a strategy, no, that's for sure. But it has a strategic impact, right, potentially?
Well, almost everything does.
Okay, fair enough. If I could comment on something that Nabil said. Nabil and I saw each other 2 weeks ago, I think, in Cairo, where the Munich Security Conference had a core group meeting. That core group meeting in Cairo was followed by a core group meeting in Doha. And we took 30 internationals from Cairo to Doha, but the set of our Arab interlocutors was quite a different set of interlocutors in Cairo and in Doha. And that goes precisely to the point of Arab unity, or to be very specific, to GCC unity. And having lost that unity and observing as an outsider the GCC being so deeply divided amounts exactly to what Anthony Cordesman has said earlier. It's an invitation to outside powers to meddle in your affairs, and that's a very sad thing to observe. And on the JCPOA, I would also agree. Iranian aspiration for hegemony in the region is a real issue, and at times it has been underestimated by certain European observers, but the JCPOA was designed precisely to contain Iranian hegemonial ambitions in one area, and it was not supposed to be the end of the story. So certainly Germany, along with the UK and France, is very much in the business of maintaining the JCPOA precisely because we want to contain Iranian ambitions. And finally, there was a question about NATO. And on that, I'm not sure what the question was exactly, but I would say one reason NATO is relevant is that Europe remains quite an important strategic area of the world. It's 500 million people, the European Union. It is the largest single market in the world. It is an important player in trade. It has huge potential in terms of technology. So there is an interest on the part of the United States of America, I think. And certainly that is something after 3 years in Washington, D.C., that I can see very strongly in Congress.
So I'm not going to let you off the hook before
please.
I go to Mark, but on the issue of NATO, you talk about NATO almost as a solid, healthy entity. But you have the rise of illiberalism inside NATO.
That's true.
How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I think that's a broader question. Everything, if we talk about military capabilities here, I think we also have to be aware of the fact that if within our countries, if within societies we lose cohesion, political, social, and so on, suddenly we have a big issue. The rise...
Not dissimilar to the GCC, for instance.
Yeah, true.
Right.
But not as dramatic, right? So if we end up with the AFD at 25% in Thuringia, that's very unpleasant, not something we'd like to see, but it's manageable. Even Brexit is manageable at the end of the day because there's a clear decision on the part of Germany, France, and others to maintain very close relations with the UK, specifically in the area of security and defense. So the point is we're really challenged in that regard, but it does not mean the end of NATO or the end of the EU.
Thank you.
Yes, there are three very important points, of course: missile defense, domestic arms production, and threat perceptions. On the first point, obviously this has been always this race between offensive and defensive weapons is characteristic of the whole history of armament. No, the problem now with that, the spread and the scope of proliferations is so broad, from rockets, manpads up to intercontinental missiles that we blur the difference between conventional and nuclear, and that's a risk, a heightened risk. When you see the United States developing the prompt global strike, conventional long-distance precision-guided missile capable of eradicating command and control of nuclear weapon systems, which could be mistaken as a nuclear attack. So that's lowering the threshold of risk of nuclear war. On domestic production, this has been also a result of sanctions and isolations. Look at the case of North Korea, Iran. They've increased their domestic production precisely because they could not rely on the international market. Now, what we witness is a sort of dual or sort of mutual dependency. Like recently I co-signed OPED in France because the French Minister of Defense said that France had to export, was bound to export, didn't have any other choice to export conventional weapons because this was the only way to ensure its national defense, including nuclear deterrence, which sounded a little bit contradictory to this objective of national defense and then being dependent on your clients. And finally, most of what we've been discussing, we focused on the symptom, on the result, arms proliferation, but we forgot to look about the root causes, which is, basically threat perceptions. And that can be based on facts, it can be based on false or exaggerated threat perceptions. So this is perhaps where we had to act to reduce this resort to arms buildup.
Thank you. We've had time for maybe one or two more interventions. Abdul Mosem Saeed. You're on.
No. Thank you very much for giving me the chance. And I want to record my disappointment of the panelists, because there is a major deficit that I was expecting from this panel. This panel is about, as I understood, about the global military power. And I heard a lot of capabilities, a lot of military spending, all good information. However, I never knew what for. I mean, military power is made as all sorts of power to achieve certain objectives. Showmanship sometimes help. You can talk about obliteration, you talk about annihilation, it might help. But that's not really the power effectiveness in the use in the modern world, now and tomorrow. And the advice for the Arab countries...
So just give me your question. It's hard to hear.
My question is for Tony Coatsman and the other panelists, that why you are emphasizing capabilities without talking about what the objectives, what countries really want to do.
So the question is, what are the objectives? So just you know,
global, what are the global objectives now?
Right. Appreciate that. We'll take one more. I want to say that the panel, because I define the panel, is not only about military capabilities, but also the transitions in technology and how that global map looks like. I think your point is really important, so we'll get to objectives in just a second.
Technologies are capabilities also.
Sterling Jensen. Uh-oh, Sterling Jensen disappeared.
This is me.
Okay,
right here.
I'm sorry, Abdul Khaled Abdullah. I apologize.
That's me, right here, right in the middle. Steve.
Oh, there you are. Hey, good. Great.
This is a common question, maybe addressed also to Coatsman. We always love, appreciate your candid talk, especially when you point to and blame the Arab Gulf states for the mess that has been created in the region. But I would like to fully, totally, absolutely disagree with you on this issue, if you don't mind. The way we look at it, from where we sit, from where I come from, I see that the US has mishandled the region. And it is the US that has been responsible for all the turmoils in the region for the past, 50 years. And let me give you three even example, if you allow me.
Just really fast, because we have 5 minutes and I've got to finish on time.
Sir, very fast, very fast. The inaction, Obama's inaction in Syria, American action in Iraq, Trump's maximum pressure on Iran, let alone 50 years of America being on the wrong side of justice in Palestine. You look at all this list and others, you see that America has mismanaged the region, not us. It made us, because of this management, spend $2 trillion on arms purchase from the United States. So my question, very briefly, do you think less of America in our midst, less of America, is a good thing for the region, Mr. Kurtzman? Thank you very much.
Great question. So let's take these two, one asking the fundamental question beyond capacity. It's a question about purpose and what are the purposes in geostrategic competition. The second is, which dovetailed to some degree with the point I made earlier, is maybe a little bit less American involvement, better or worse. I had posed the question of whether Donald Trump himself, someone had made the comment that policy looked like strategic contraction of the United States from many of these causes around the world. So if we can do it in a minute or less, you'll make Ebtisam very happy. Tony Coatsman.
There is no question that the United States made quite a number of strategic mistakes from the outside. In every case, there was a prior drastic failure on the part of unity and progress and order within the Arab world. And the aftermath, which often could have been vastly better, did not see any particular improvement. The reason I focused on the Game of Thrones here is, to be blunt, it's not going to be solved from the outside. And what we have now, just with the boycott alone, is not our mistake. And that one example should warn everybody in this room how silly things can get for all the wrong reasons. Now let me just say about global objectives. What global objectives? China is expanding as an economic and military power. We are reacting to part of that expansion. So is India. Those reactions are completely different. Russia is, on the one hand, exploiting the near abroad, and on the other hand, trying to reassert its status, as it did in Syria. The problem is that those are only part, and small parts, of this whole structure of military technology and the changes in the military balance in the world. And they're not global in character. We, as a global power, have to react to a number of these challenges. But if you look at the number of challenges in the world, for all the talk of the US as a global policeman, we actually react to a relatively small number.
Right. Boris Ruga, 1 minute.
Less than that, I think. Objectives. I'll go back to to my quote from President Macron. The issue for Europe, and this is what our objective should be, is to maintain democracy, pluralism, the rule of law, stability for the 500 million people who make up the European Union. That's the objective. And military power should underpin our effort to maintain, if you like, you can call it European sovereignty. That's what we need to do, and that plays out in different dimensions as well. But that is, we're not looking to project power, we're looking basically to maintain the free societies that we have created.
Mark Vinod.
Yes, thank you. I share the frustration of the gentleman who asked the question about objectives, because this was the whole section of my presentation, military power for what?
We'll let you email it.
Thank you. I will just quote William Burns, very prominent American diplomat, when he read a study about the cost of the war on terror. There was a very interesting study by the Watson Institute that revealed that since 9/11, the United States spent $6 trillion on the war on terror, with the results that you can all judge, and it caused 500,000 deaths. And so he said the shock of September 11 led us to rely even more on the American military as our tool of first resort, with diplomacy and afterthought, with fewer and fewer resources. I think that leads back to what His Excellency the Minister said. Perhaps we need less military power and more diplomacy.
Thank you. What I'd like to say in conclusion, first, there's been a very rich discussion. I want to thank our panel here, which I will in a moment. But again, reflecting on the fact, not just because of the Berlin Wall, but moving out of the Cold War into something else. I remember people like Kenichi Omai, and talking about the end of states and essentially the borderless world, Francis Fukuyama and the end of history. Bill Clinton's type of globalization was a kind of high-trust globalization. You could move people and ideas and institutions more frictionlessly around the world. Today we have a lot of interconnectedness in the world, but rather than having high-trust globalization, I think we have high-fear globalization. Borders are back, And there is fear. Oda Aberdeen talked about strategic fear. I think that strategic fear exists in a lot of corners in the world. And I think to the gentleman that was asking about motivation, I think part of the motivation that drives people may not be conscious, but it may be an innate fear of an uncertainty in this age we're going. When you add technology, AI, the kinds of weapon systems we were just discussing that we may be on the precipice of, it makes it far more dangerous in many ways, in my view, and it gives us something to think about. So thank you very much to Mark Vinod of the Geneva Center for Security Policy, Boris Ruga of the Munich Security Conference, and Anthony Cordesman of the Center for Strategic International Studies. I'm Steve Clemens. Thank you all very much for joining us. Thank you.